This video is to introduce you to the idea of contrived STEM activities versus authentic STEM activities in the K-12 classroom. And we're going to look at sort of a range of activities and where they would fall on this continuum. So if you're thinking about engaging students in the practices and engaging them in the practices for the purpose of understanding a phenomenon or solving a problem, we would deem that actually being engaged in an authentic research project. But starting at the top, you think about activities that don't engage students in the practices and they're not related to any future authentic research project. That would be sort of one end of the spectrum versus activities that engage students in the practices as they're conducting an authentic research project. That would be at the very opposite end of the spectrum. And then we have these two sort of categories in between. And I'll just sort of say that these four bins or categories, so to speak, are not set in stone. They certainly have overlaps, and we could talk about whether a certain activity would fall in one or another, depending on some of the details of what's happening in the classroom. But just in general, we sort of think about activities that are going on in these ways. So looking at the second bin, activities that do engage students in the practices, but then are not part of further research project as they're engaging in the activity, and it's not going to support a future research project, that would be this second category. And then activities that do engage the students in the practices and are not part of an ongoing research project as of yet, but serve to support those students in engaging in a future authentic research project. That would be the third category. So I'm going to kind of walk through using what we heard from Max Bissong, the teacher from Bald Eagle High School, using the idea of him wanting students to learn about incoming and outgoing solar radiation and warming of the climate in the way that he did it, but I'm going to use other activities that I know teachers have used in the classroom to teach the same concept. Also, when I talk about these and have future slides, you're going to see these sort of abbreviations of these different categories. So the one in member activities without science and engineering practices, and that there's no research project, all the way to activities with science and engineering practices, and they're engaged in a current research project. So for this first category, so to speak, that they're not engaged in the practices, and it really has nothing to do with engaging them in a future authentic research project. This would be one example. So students are setting up climate boxes using instructions provided by the teacher to observe temperature changes with and without greenhouse gases. This we would consider an activity without science and engineering practices. They may or may not be collecting temperature data, but it is fairly contrived. Scientists don't tend to set up climate boxes and study the climate in these ways. And this is an activity that is driven by the teacher. The teacher is providing instructions. They're not thinking about how to design and carry out an investigation. So it's very, very limited in terms of engaging them in the practices, and this would not be leading to necessarily something where they would engage in a research project. It wouldn't necessarily support them in doing that. This is the one where students are engaged in the practices in the activity, but it is not part of an ongoing research project, nor are students working on a future authentic research project where this would be preparing them for that. So an example of that would be, students work with 30 years of temperature data provided by the teacher. This data came from, say, the NOAA website, which is where most of our climate and weather data is collected. And it is provided to the students in a Google Sheet to create and interpret graphs showing temperature changes at specific locations on Earth. So we would consider this engaging the students in the practices. If it were to stop here, and this was what the teacher sort of ended with in teaching students about climate change, we would fit this in category 2. So they're not going to use this way of analyzing the data, creating them, interpreting the graphs to do something in the future on their own to further investigate and understand what's happening on Earth. This third category, this is where students do engage in the practices, and these activities are not part of an ongoing research project, but ultimately this activity will support them in doing future authentic STEM research. So this kind of is in line with what Max talked about, that the students completed these tutorials and they walked them through a series of steps to teach them how to manipulate the code and look at the data and prepare these charts and graphs and models and maps, that they really practiced doing that. And it was all very teacher driven. They were given the instructions on how to do this. But it built their skill base in order to actually take that forward into doing their own authentic research project. So they were learning to manipulate existing code, building new sections of code, say, to actually run the models and prepare the output from their model runs. And then lastly, we would say is a set of activities that engage students in the actual practices as they're conducting an authentic research project. So this would be in line with the part of the project where the students, after doing the set of tutorials and having this common experience of learning how to write the code and generate the output from the data analysis, running the model, that they were then tasked with coming up with their own research project. They had to come up with at least 2 places on Earth that they were going to make comparisons. They had to have a rationale for why are they comparing these 2 different places? Why is it compelling? What is the research question that they're trying to answer by doing this? And so this is the point at which the students were actually engaged in an authentic research project and engaged in the practices while doing that. So with this background, we're wanting you to run through some examples of other activities and sort of try to categorize where you think those activities would go in these 4 different bins, so to speak, of activities. And we look forward to seeing your responses and discussing this next week.